Welcome to the Anti-Architect Podcast. I am your host, Christian Giordano. As president and owner of the design firm Mancini Duffy, I am driven by a quest for learning and radically changing the industry. With this podcast, I'm hoping to improve the industry that I'm so passionate about by taking a critical look at how architects work through a variety of voices and shared experiences. Hello, Anti-Architect Podcast listeners. I'm excited to have Ozzie Nelson here in the studio as my guest on the Anti-Architect Podcast. Since 2003, Ozzie has served as CEO of Nelson Worldwide, an award-winning design firm headquartered in Minneapolis. Founded by his father in 1997, Ozzie joined the firm when they were 15 people. Today, they are over 700 people with 18 offices around the United States. Nelson is known today for its diverse practice areas from workplace, education, hospitality, healthcare, sports and entertainment, to fashion and retail. Their clients include Google, Hershey, Cisco, Saks Fifth Avenue, Simon Property Group, Macy's, Hilton, Target, my daughter's favorite American Girl doll, Yum Brands, and many, many more. Since Ozzie became CEO, the firm has executed more than 40 mergers and acquisitions, landing Nelson among the top 10 architecture firms in the United States. Ozzie and the firm have won countless awards. He is also a member of the Young Presidents Organization, YPO, which I'm a member of, and I've talked about here, the Twin Cities chapter. Ozzie, it's an honor to have you here. I've long been an admirer of you and your firm.
Well, very gracious of you, and I'm very excited to be here, Christian. I'm a real fan of what you're doing here.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. So your real name is John Ozzie Nelson Jr. Just curious where Ozzie came from.
So as you said, I'm a junior, and being a junior, in my case, I was at best Johnny and at worst Little Johnny.
Okay.
And in ninth grade, I went to a French class, and we had a substitute teacher who asked if I was any relation to Ozzie and Harriet Nelson, the famous TV show, and it stuck. And I took it. Interesting story about that. I took it to college and wasn't sure if I was going to, make this break and take the name. And I ended up knowing no one at college but winning freshman class president because of the name exclusively. So it served me well.
That's right. It's like that Eddie Murphy movie, the name you know.
Yes, exactly right.
That's right. That's really funny. So this is the first time we're actually meeting in person. And as I said, I've long been an admirer of you and the way you've built your firm. And in my own mind, I'm emulating kind of what you've built through sort of acquisitions and trying to hire the right people, diversity of projects, or project types, great design. And I think of great design as sort of corporate great design, which is probably a little bit different than other aspects of kind of what we do. So, and from an outsider, you seem to have a great culture in the way you've merged all of these firms. So it really is truly a pleasure to have you here. I have to ask these questions. If you had to pick one thing, what annoys you about architects?
It's interesting. I thought a lot about, first of all, there's this whole concept of talking to architects about what bothers them about architects, I think is very provocative. I think there's obviously the stereotype of the arrogance or the self-absorption. I think the reality is, as I prepared for our conversation today and I look back, I think there's been such an evolution in the industry. I think, unfortunately, the contrarian in me wants to say, it's the same thing that bothers me about a Democrat or a Republican, right? There's this stigma.
Yeah.
And then there's the reality of what is going on. So, again, I think if you take the stereotype, it is about self-absorption. It is about elitism. It is about a lack of collaboration. But I do see in real ways that breaking down every single day in terms of market forces and just a change in culture that comes with generations.
Yeah, I would agree. Even in our YPO, there is actually a small group, but a group of architects, and we get together and we talk about kind of the industry and what exactly is going on and how can we support each other, which I don't think was the case 20 years ago.
And
we were all enemies.
And the other thing I reflected on is, part of that comes with sort of an education and the wrapping yourself around whatever label you want. But I do think that, creative people just process things differently.
Yeah.
And I think that also, again, in terms of decision making and styles of work, creatives work differently than more linear people.
Yeah, agreed. Is there anything in particular about the industry as a whole that just drives you crazy? Is something that really gnaws at you?
I think it's the looking back more than looking forward. I think it's an industry that has always been an apprentice industry, and there's a certain it's great to have pride, but it's another thing to be stuck on the way things have always been done.
Yeah.
And I think there has been and will continue to be a tremendous amount of disruption in the industry. And I think there tends to be many people who want to cloak themselves around the way things have been done and want to look at new ways of doing things as not authentic.
Right. I appreciate that. That's great. So you have a business background, and I'm sure that you believe that that's contributed to your success ultimately, as an owner of an architecture firm and design firm. In your mind, do you believe that architecture and design are an art or some sort of social dialogue with the world, or is it a business and problem solving for a client? Like, what's your take on that? As someone, I almost want to say as like a business person, outsider, but now your entire life has been in this field.
Again, as I sort of reflected on the journey in preparation of our conversation, I was. For those old enough to remember, I was Alex P. Keaton, right? I was the Michael J. Fox character that came into this industry and saw a very different view of architects and thought that this was, really something that, was a business problem. I very honestly have come to appreciate that it's both art and science. It's both inspiration and poetry and business.
Yeah.
And I think that's the challenge, but that's also the exciting part about this industry is being able to thoughtfully integrate those things. I think a business that doesn't have rigor and discipline and strategy won't be successful. But on the other hand, you have to, in any business, adapt to what your employee base is, what your audience is, and ultimately what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, and I think for me in my firm, sometimes we separate the let's call it the real architecture, the art, from the day to day. And there are things that come in the door, and everyone will stop and pause and say, "Whoa, for a minute, we have take a little time here and think about this because this is real architecture. This could have a real impact on society." And then as a corporate architecture firm, as you know, you're doing a lot of what the client needs and wants and for their business, and which there's nothing wrong with that. And
yes.
you parse the two out and you move on with your day.
Yes.
So I just want to talk a little bit about sort of the model itself. Do you think, especially again, as what we do as corporate architects, not as black cape architects, that we need to talk amongst one another about sort of our fee structure and how we get paid and when we get paid. This is something that I can tell you as a designer moving up in an architecture firm, and then having owned an architecture firm now for the last 10 years, I have a very different perspective, right? And so I just curious of your thoughts, and especially at your scale, stuff's tight. It's tight. It's hard to make money sometimes. How do you deal with that?
Yes. Your audience can't see, but I'm nodding my head. I think the business model really is critical to that whole idea of how you make money, obviously, and the whole pricing dynamic. I obviously, if you look at the way that we've evolved, I believe in scale, and I believe that scale is something that it can allow you to hit certain price points that you couldn't otherwise. I do think that there's a whole wallet share part of what we should be doing. I listened to one of your previous podcasts, and I think it was David Supple who talked about, architects used to be the master builders.
Right.
And if you really think about at a high level, what architects have been doing, it's been like sort of carving out all the things that they could have been to be this more niche thing, right? They got out of being the master builder. Then they didn't want to get into interiors, so interiors were born. And I think this is an industry, and this may be unpopular with the audience, but from my perspective, what gave way to the tenant rep and the project management organizations is that architects weren't doing that. They couldn't self-police themselves. Had the architects been able to self-police themselves, be the master builder, be all these other things, we wouldn't be talking about pricing.
Yeah.
But when you keep looking at what you don't want to do, and keep carving out core parts of where the business model is, you're going to find yourself in a place where you're very vulnerable, and you don't have a lot of leverage. I think leverage is key to holding your own in any pricing conversation.
Yeah, it's true. If you hire a lawyer, you don't hire an intermediate to manage the lawyer, right? And you do that in our world, in our industry, which is really interesting. Do you ever? So you're not an architect by practice, by training. Do you ever get pushback like from the AIA or traditional architects?
Of course. It's 10:30, so not today yet. But honestly, I do think that that's also about evolving in terms of really understanding them, understanding the industry. I think I get a lot less pushback today than I did, earlier in my career. But that has as much to do about the way that I engage in the conversation, right, as how they've come to see me.
Yeah, I mean, the previous firm that I worked at, HLW, they brought in a business person to their credit, and that business person turned that firm around, and is a valuable part of that organization. And that always kind of stuck out in my mind, like, oh, this is interesting. Maybe we need help on the business side as architects.
Yes.
And one last question about architects, and this is going to kind of fold into really how you built Nelson, but when you're sort of looking to make acquisitions, and I'm pretty sure I understand kind of a lot of your acquisitions, do architects have a plan for their retirement? Or are they always just working to the very end, and then at some point they think, uh-oh, what am I going to do now? I have to retire, sell my firm, or it just goes away. What happens to my people? Do you have a sense of that, having done so many acquisitions?
I think that's all over the board, to be honest with you. I do think one of the things that changed, and I don't know exactly the time frame here, but it changed, is that architects would build a practice. They would take the lion's share of the profits. That would be their retirement, and then they would turn the firm over to the people that were there before. And then I guess there's, somebody somewhere along the line said, hey, I could sell this thing, right? And so they get an investment banker, they sell for $1 million. And then now all of a sudden there's an enterprise value to something that people didn't think had an enterprise value. I also think that, I often joke when I joined my father's 14-person firm, the technology guy was the guy that could string the drafting board, right? And if you think about how capital intensive, how marketing intensive, just how complex this business has become, I think there's this combination of an industry that's changing so fast that there are a lot of people that are opting out where they may have not retired before. And I think there's this idea that people now want to monetize what they've built. So the combination of those two things has driven a lot of the conversations.
Yeah, yeah. So let's talk about that and your journey from joining your father's firm when they were 14, 15 people, to this extraordinary scale and growth. And I remember when I bought Mancini Duffy for all intents and purposes, myself and my other partners. We had hired an executive coach, and we talked about sort of growth scales, and they show this. They show this sort of, let's call it mountain climbing chart, right? And it's all about sort of the peaks and plateaus and then the valleys, right? And it's very difficult to take a company from $0 to $1 million in revenue, and it's really difficult to then get to $5 million in revenue to $10 million in revenue and 50, 100, and so on and so forth. And those jumps come with extraordinary complexity. Right there, the complexity side of your organization goes way up as you jump to those things, and frankly, I struggle right now with getting above the $20-25 million mark. Right, like I'm pushing and pushing. We had COVID in there, probably would have gotten there, but still, now we're back in that range, but. That jump to 50 for me seems so daunting, right? I've got to double in size and double in everything, right? And how the hell do I manage all of, I can barely manage what we've got going on right now. So, can you walk me through your mindset when you started, with 15 people?
The journey kind of breaks into really three different legs of the journey, if you will. One is experiencing a fair amount of organic growth, growing the $1 million firm to the $10 million firm, but a very heavy concentration on one client, Bank of America. And in fact, at 10 million, I think 90% of our revenue is coming from Bank of America.
Oh, wow. Risky too.
Which was very risky. And I didn't really see the risk until there were some changes at the client level. And so I think one of the interesting things is I think there's a danger to look at our story and think that I was very risk averse. It was actually risk that drove me. It was just the risk that I saw and maybe the outsiders didn't see. So 90% concentration in a client that I'm not sure I'm going to keep is a big risk.
Right.
And so the first leg of the journey was to acquire interiors firms that would give, and the bank came to us and said, look, you guys are number 37, Gensler's number 1. Shouldn't we be talking to 36 other firms in between you guys? And they wanted scale and they wanted a platform. So in 3 years, I came up with this non-cash formula because the one thing I didn't have was cash. And I was able to do a deal with 13 firms and grow from 10 million to 53 million and basically build that network of all interior firms. That was just in time for 0809.
Perfect.
And now I've got all this overhead and all these what I called feed me firms because they were good at servicing their clients, but they weren't entrepreneurial. And now all the faucets had turned off.
Yeah.
And it was a real slog to get through 0809.
So with that, just to back up the cash side of things.
Yeah.
So how do you acquire firms without cash? What's the mechanism to do that? So
in those days, my formula was, look, you're feeling the same pressure I am. You're 2 or 3 million. Your clients are demanding a network of you. This industry is getting more and more complicated. I've got all the back office, plus I have a network. So you come in and be the Chicago office or the Minneapolis office, and let's create a new co. I wouldn't do any deal that I didn't have at least 51% ownership in.
Okay.
And I will guarantee your salary and your compensation levels. And I will even say that if the EBITDA doesn't move, I don't get a penny, which is a big risk.
Yeah.
But you've been stuck at this level. So if you do go above the EBITDA level, I want a distribution based on the percentage of equity that you have and I have.
Got it.
And as I did more and more deals, I was able to go, literally the first deal was 51-49. And we were able, toward the end of that cycle of non-cash deals, to get to like an 80-20 model where we were getting the bulk of the distribution if, in fact, we got them bigger.
Got it. Okay. So then 08-09 hits, you're still concentrated in sort of interiors and financials. And I think what I find most admirable about you is your pivot. Right, you're almost like doubling down and saying, nope, actually, we're going to do more. We're going to grow even more substantially. I want my leadership team to listen up to this because I'm constantly pushing this. And, you've diversified the practice to do all sorts of different things, from out of the ground architecture to, large, complex, buildings and campuses, and retail and hospitality, all of those things. And I'm doing that as well, obviously not at the same scale, but that's constantly what I'm preaching to everyone, because I watched the same thing in 08-09, and I'm not risk adverse. I am all about risk, definitely. What I've proven is I'm willing to take risks. However, I love hedging my risk with the ability to do a lot of different things. And I find sometimes I feel kind of silly when a client says, or a prospective client says, well, what do you do? And I kind of rattle off everything, and it's one of those things. Am I sort of a, what is it, jack of all trades and expert in none kind of thing? But I don't feel that that's really what architects are. We don't do sports stadiums. That I can say, but we kind of do everything else, even airports at this point. So take me through that process. How did you make that pivot? And then ultimately, what did YPO help in that scale model? Yeah.
YPO was a great experience for me. I think just having access to, when you're in when you start in a small family business, there can be nothing more insular than that, right? And so YPO expanded a network, and being in a forum, and all the things that come with that kind of a professional organization, and getting beyond the headlines and being able to really talk to people about how they've approached things was invaluable to me.
Yeah.
There's one person at this point in the journey I always love to give credit to, and that's Mark Zweig. And I was having a conversation with Mark. I actually had called Ed Friedrichs. Ed Friedrichs had called me when we acquired GHK, and he came and called me in Minneapolis. He'd already retired from Gensler, and we had breakfast. He's like, so what are you up to? And we had this really good conversation, and he was helpful in some observations. And then a couple of years later, I was trying to get a deal done in the Bay Area, and I felt like I was wasting too much time. It was a very design-centric environment where there wasn't a lot of the same market pressures that everybody else was feeling, and it was because of that I wasn't getting traction. So I called Ed, and Ed said, you know what, call Mark Zweig. You ever hear Mark Zweig? Call Mark Zweig. And within like 10 minutes of talking to Mark says, look, it sounds like here's what you're trying to do. You're trying to grow your practices, you're trying to grow your services, and you're trying to grow your geographies. Those are the three circles. And where do you want to end up? And I said, well, I want to end up, north of 100 million. I want to have this diversified practices. He said, so it doesn't matter what sequence you buy companies in, as long as it's advancing the ball to where you want to end up. And so once I started to use those three circles, literally we went from 40 to 80 million in 18 months.
Wow.
Because the deal flow changed because I was much broader in terms of what I was looking for. I would say the thing that has been highly complicated about the way that we have chosen to do this, and again, I have felt a real race against time in terms of having an organization at times that was sort of half built and having to get to that other side. We were not in the industrial architecture business. Mm-hmm. And then you start to make the movement into that. You're kind of building 8 practices at the same time, all simultaneously while you're also building out a geographic network. Unless you have a really strong stomach, I don't suggest doing it that way. But the point is, that's where I really felt we needed to go to become economically sustainable, and we needed to get there as quickly as we could. So there was a lot, I think, a lack of. I would tell people where we were going. There were not a lot of people that believed we would get there. And I think it's also hard to attract the talent, the top talent for any of those practices when you're not there yet.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of sort of concessions around the acquisitions that we could get done. Either because, capital kind of came later in the game for us. So, we went as far as we could with that non-cash formula. Then we were using some capital, and it wasn't really until I did the 2 large acquisitions in 2018 where we more than doubled our size and brought 3 organizations together that I really had the right capital structure to get that done.
Right.
And was able to have to really handpick the 2 organizations that I thought would complete the whole organization that we were trying to build.
Yeah. So that was the next couple of questions of mine were, have you taken on investors, I guess, in a sense, right? To, private equity or whatever it might be to help, bolster yourself.
Yeah. So I have retained 80% ownership of the firm. We have shareholders in the company that are both active employees, as well as a couple of legacy shareholders that came from former acquisitions.
Okay.
Our primary structure is all either mezz or senior lending. So we've been able to use the capital structure and still maintain a large part of the equity.
Okay. Yeah, I feel like for me, I still need to get to a scale, like a certain scale, before I can go and say to someone, hey, look at all these things. Now give me money to that I can now invest and double, triple, quadruple, right? So, yeah, that's always a struggle, right? A lot of people will say to me, even in YPO, why don't you just take on private equity? I go, well, it doesn't really work that way.
Right,
private equity is going to look at an architecture firm and go, what the hell are you talking about? There's no value here.
Right. And plus, when you reach a point where you really start to take advantage of the scale, and until that point, the EBIT is not there.
Right.
So you're parting with so much equity if you make that decision early on, that you never really recover.
Exactly. Yeah. So what's the strategy in terms of finding those firms? How are you finding them? Is it Zweig? I'm very familiar with Zweig. They actually helped us with our ownership transition here. Yeah. And I was just on their podcast as well. And I think Mark's definitely a future guest here. We're going to get him.
He's a real character. I love Mark.
And so how are you finding these firms, and even getting to that conversation level and picking up the phone, like, hey, I'd like to buy your firm?
Yeah. There is a fair amount of that. I mean, in the early days, it was purely driven by looking on the environment and either, buying a pesky competitor. I've always looked for firms that have a history of keeping their clients. If you're able to keep your clients and your people, that says a lot about the success, that the way you manage, the stability of the firm. One of the reasons I have always preferred merger acquisition to heavy organic growth is again back to the risk profile. People always say people point to the integration risk and all of that. But I look at organic growth, so you go and you buy some, or you hire some leader. Then the leader comes in and says, well, I don't have a design leader. So then you go and you get a design leader. Uh-huh. And then that person says, well, I don't have a technical leader. Now you have a whole bench of people, and then they go out and pitch, and the client says, have you guys ever worked? No, we never worked together, right? So now I get $1 million worth of expense and no revenue being generated. So, I think, the organic growth is not only slower, it has risks that people a lot of times don't identify.
Yeah.
To the identification, as a known acquirer, I probably get 5 or 6 emails or phone calls or whatever a week. I do think that I would say humbly, I think we've not only done the acquisitions, I think we've done them well. So I think there's a lot of people that when they think about selling their firm, they'll put us on the list as a firm that, they want to take a look at them.
Yeah.
I would say that there's just a lot that comes to us. I am always looking, though, as we compete in the marketplace, who's a firm that's really interesting that I respect.
Okay.
And I think the other thing about the way that I look at merger acquisition is some people are looking to kind of almost kind of a roll-up strategy. I'm always looking for how does 1 and 1 make 3? How does that firm come in and really help to transform us? And again, when you see those people in the marketplace, it's pretty obvious the ones that you think could make a difference if they were a part of your organization.
Do they all become Nelson on day one, or is it where they keep sort of some of their identity?
Yeah.
And how do you roll the cultures together?
Yeah. So I'll give you today's answer is that I think it's really important. I always say that you should take the legacy name of whoever you acquired and the Nelson name. And after the integration's done, when people close their eyes and think of Nelson, they think of both organizations.
I like that.
So have we really maximized the brand equity of the organization that we've acquired before they've cut over to Nelson? And we do that in a number of ways, but there's usually a co-branding period of time. But I think we do a good job of making sure that people understand that, Brand X has joined us. I am looking at one acquisition in particular that's in the industry, but kind of an interesting segment. And I might keep their brand.
Okay.
And I think, we're getting to a certain size and scale where it's not necessarily assumed, if there's a real synergy between what we do as an organization, i.e., if we were to buy somebody that's really strong in industrial, we would want them to be Nelson, and we would want to bolster our industrial. If we're buying somebody that doesn't neatly fit into the 8 practices that we're in, and that there's an opportunity to capture a different part of the market, I would be open to them keeping their brand.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. Now, hard question. Have any of these failed? And you don't have to name names, but have
none. 40 plus, they've all gone. Especially, although I have had ones where there was a well-capitalized deal and it still didn't work out. I think the earlier ones where I had to be more opportunistic, and I had to make concessions. The bigger the organization has gotten, the less of a concession I can make with culture. In the early days, I made a lot of concessions on culture. Sure. And that made the integrations all the more complicated.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, and in my experience, it was before my time. Mancini bought TSC Design, and they didn't do a really good job with that. And to that point, there's only one person left over from that deal of a 100-person firm, and that's actually my partner, Bill Mandera, who was ironically wanted to be the first one out the door when that happened. So it's pretty funny. But then when we've done acquisitions there, we've learned from not Bill's mistake, but from that mistake period, and sort of that integration into culture is extremely important. It's not going to always work out really well or 100% of the time, but really trying to, I think you're right, there's a reason why those companies were successful, right? And so what was successful about them, and how can they help us? I don't pretend to have all the answers. So how can we feed off of one another? Maybe they do things better than us, and great, then let's do it that way, kind of thing.
I really have come to appreciate in terms of, I often think, what would the Johnson administration be without Vietnam, right? and we all have our Vietnams, right? I think particularly in culture, in merger acquisition, how much of the company being acquired is a cult culture. Mm-hmm. And there are just some organizations that are so wedded to what they have been. that no matter what you do and no matter what the logic is going forward in terms of better career, better compensation, better, all those other things, there's just some organizations that can't move on from what they've been. And that's one thing that I've learned to really look for.
Yeah. Yeah. In terms of your sort of day to day, how do you stay connected with such a large organizations? And, or do you go to all the offices? How does that work? I struggle with going to 3 offices. I can't imagine, 18 plus.
Well, first of all, I'm very blessed to have a high energy level and not need a lot of sleep. So
Me too.
I do. And it's kind of interesting. Pre-pandemic, I really saw my role much differently. Today, I'm much more. I'm a combination of outward focused, but really operationally focused. And so our structure is 8 practices. Each has a practice leader. Practice leaders responsible for market vision, revenue generation, best practice, and a business leader who think of as a COO for that practice. And they work hand in glove to run the practice. Both of those positions report to me. So there's a regular cadence in which I'm connected with those folks to have a conversation not only about the operational side, but the vision side of where we're going. And I find that that's, I've had a lot of different structures over the years. That's been really successful for me in terms of staying connected with them.
Okay.
Before the pandemic, I was on the road 4 days a week. I am now on the road 2 days a week is probably a heavy week for me.
Okay.
I'm, really, and it's interesting because I would get on a plane, I'd go to an office, I'd be there very quickly, then I was on to the next office. And I, to some degree, just felt like I was chasing my tail and I wasn't connecting with people as much as I hoped. I do think this combination of a regular cadence of Zoom meetings and personal, that's one of the reasons I'm in New York. I timed it with your podcast. I was with the New York team for 2 hours yesterday.
Right.
And so I think there's no replacement for that. But I do think that, the whole post-pandemic environment makes a lot more sense in terms of hybrid, in terms of in-person and using the right mix.
Are you doing things like business development and going on client pitches? Do you get involved to that level?
I will.
Okay.
Particularly if it's, the biggest thing I can say in a pitch, which is obviously genuine, is, the very top of the house cares about this, and you'll get my cell phone number. And if we don't deliver everything that we're going to say that we will, call me. Yeah. And then it's an opportunity to check in from there. So yeah, I do. There's some maybe 5% of the pitches that I do participate in one way or another.
That's great. I always say, and I try to instill this in our company as well, that, winning a project, getting a client, it's a miracle. It really is, And it's funny. I was with Chad Oppenheim in our YPO forum, Architects Forum, and he said the same thing, like unsolicited. Every client is a miracle, and it's true. And I do the same thing. I give the clients, like, you can call me anytime. Like, I am genuinely grateful to have clients. Like, they are, wow, you put a lot of trust in me and our firm and a lot of money and all of those things. It really is a wonderful thing to win clients.
And as you know, many times that's an intangible where they're just making a leap of faith. Yep. And that's when it means the most.
Yep, exactly. So a little bit about your backstory. Where did you grow up? What did you want to be growing up? And how did your father get into the business? Is your father still alive?
My father is alive.
Okay, great. So he's enjoying watching this?
Yes.
Is he involved in the business?
He was until the pandemic, and
Okay.
he's had some health challenges,
Okay.
and so less so, but very, very passionate about design, and still has an office. And again, until the pandemic, he was in 3 days a week or something like that.
That's great. So where'd you grow up?
So I grew up in Philadelphia, and my I guess the kind of break in my story is I at 11 or 12, became a street hockey player, and then became an ice hockey player. And my hockey coach then went away to a boarding school in New England. And if you're a hockey player in Philadelphia, there's like 3 arenas in Philadelphia. And this idea to be able to go to a place where you had your own arena and you could really take a run at maybe being a college hockey player. So I went away to boarding school in New England, and then I wanted to go to Babson College, and I got waitlisted, and I didn't really have a backup. And so again, my hockey coach said, well, there's a couple of schools in Minnesota if you want to look at those. And I went out and I looked at the university that I ended up attending, University of St. Thomas. Absolutely fell in love with it. Got into Babson and turned Babson down to go to St. Thomas. And then I guess, this series of bridges and sequences in my life. So I met my wife in freshman orientation.
Okay.
And we got married 3 weeks after we graduated.
Oh, wow.
And moved back to Philadelphia for about 10 years. And I just couldn't get the Midwest out of, there was just something about Minneapolis in terms of the perfect size. We're big enough that we have the sports teams and the arts and all of that, but small enough that it's still very kind of an intimate feel. Okay. And so when my oldest daughter was 10, we moved to Minneapolis with the idea that I wanted to do this. I was going to be on the road all the time. No office in Minneapolis, by the way.
Okay.
And you talk about things working out. So 90 days after I cut myself off from the East Coast, except by air travel, 9/11 happened. And I remember sitting at my desk and putting my head in my hands. And I always think of myself that somebody thinks more from my head than my heart. And this is what happens when you listen to your heart. But obviously it all worked out. But kind of a curious path in terms of.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Did you want to be in this business, sort of when you went to business school?
To be honest, I wanted to build scale.
Okay.
And the early day story is like, so I came in the business, I was in the business for 2 years, and it seemed like the craziest thing I'd ever done. I'm this Michael P. Keaton character in this 14-person design firm. And I had talked with my dad, and I was preparing to leave the firm. And this is when corporate America started to outsource design services. And we won a very large assignment for what was Cigna Insurance at that time, where they got rid of 20 people internally. And I still remember the meeting. We won the work, and we met with the former head of real estate, and he had this box of projects that were like half started, and they were all bound with rubber bands. And we went from like the retail business, i.e. one project at a time, to the wholesale business, where it was about managing portfolios and project management and relationship management, which all of a sudden now created a role for me.
Yeah.
And that, that was the beginning of, what we were doing for Bank of America when we were 10 million was really continuing that story. Sure. Of not having the one-off architect mentality, but having that relationship mentality where we'd help them do merger integrations. Then they'd put us on site and we would do all the day 2 work, and then we'd move on to the next merger. So, I guess my...
you were like the early JLL. And
Yeah. And there again had to pivot our business again, because a lot of the stuff that we were doing, the JLLs and the CBREs would, we went from being their partner to them moving into those businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Wow. It's such a great story, sort of that that scale. A lot of YPOers too, and I'll say this about family businesses. One thing I always thought, before I got into YPO, because there's a lot of family businesses in there, was, these guys have it easy. And what I've learned is that, no, actually a family business is very difficult, especially if you want to change it, pivot it, grow it. You're not starting on third base. You're starting fresh, regardless of what's there. So I have, it's again, admiration for what you've built. So I just want to talk a little bit kind of as we, kind of close out here about, How has COVID affected your business? And then what are you doing with the return to office? Are you guys back in the office where 3 days a week, 2 from home? Are different regions doing it differently? Like our New Jersey office does it a little bit differently than our New York office. How are you dealing with all of this?
So first of all, I would say in general, and it comes, it's not a line, it's very genuine from my heart. I think we're a 700-person startup. I mean, that's the way I think about us, We especially with this clarity around 8 practices, each of them have, and certainly there's an overarching vision and purpose to boldly transform the human experience, and that's what hopefully inspires people that work for us as opposed to work for another design firm that has another purpose. So, and ironically, since moving our P&L to the practice model, the fear would be you'd have more silos. I see so much more collaboration because there's so much more clarity around what each one of the practices does. In terms of the post-pandemic world, the pandemic was hard on us. I'm hard on me, and I would say that I now had this Ferrari to drive with all these different practices, and I was, quite frankly, a little bit too slow to click to move to double down on industrial or double down on the practices that, so we did okay. I think we could have done a lot better if we had $10 million more industrial business, for instance.
Sure.
But again, I think when you sit at the helm of an organization that has changed so much, you constantly have to keep challenging yourself to change in terms of the way that you think.
Yeah.
So post-pandemic now, that's crystal clear for me. And I'm really kind of looking at each one of the practices uniquely in terms of the opportunities that they have, and I'm also surprised. I would have thought, with a looming recession, if it ever comes, that hospitality would be the practice that is really beleaguered, and yet that's the one that's exploding, right?
I know. Restaurants for us, we're every day is a new restaurant.
Food and beverage is going crazy, right? Spec industrial has really kind of grind to a halt because of the interest rates.
Yeah.
So I think we are very well positioned with these practices. But we need to be really sensitive to look at the individual drivers for each one of them and not think of them stereotypically. In terms of back to the office, I think my position has been sort of portrayed as the trader of workplace because, I have all these workplace brokers and I'm like, you should be demanding your people to come back. And I am not the CEO that's going to pound his fist and say, come back to the office. We have a 3-day-a-week policy in terms of having people back in the office. I do think that, especially in an organization where your P&L and reporting structures is in a practice, the office has a very important role as the community that brings those practices together, and that community has to be a united front to the city that it's in and how it represents us. But I think there's a lot of case by cases where, if somebody's in our support services group and they're in the marketing team and they happen to be in New York and they drive or commute all the way into New York just to get on a Zoom call to talk to people in other cities, right? They're eventually going to quit because it doesn't make any sense to them, right? But they also should be part of the things that we purposely do to get everybody together, those social events, those cultural events. So I'm trying to be very careful to walk a balance here where I do recognize that 3-day-a-week cadence in general makes sense to bring people together. But the other piece of that too is where I think a lot of our clients are thinking differently than I. If I'm only going to pay for 3 days of a week, I'm going to rotate that, right? I'm not going to pay for 100% of the space to sit empty 4 days a week, right?
Yeah, that's true.
So there's also, a rotation that I want to work out. And, that means that not everybody, you're not always going to get Monday or Friday to be off, right? Yep. We're going to have to work that out. And that's, whether that's a lottery system or you all work it out amongst yourselves.
Yeah.
But I do think that hybrid is here to stay. And the trade-off that I would like to get is, I think when you can inspire people and when they feel a sense of connection you're going to get the most out of them. So, hopefully there's an equity trade-off that you're in the office less. But that means you have all kinds of time. You're thinking about the organization in the shower, right? Because it's not just in the office that you're working.
Yeah, it's a good point. And the same thing here. We've struggled with it. One of our partners, he really wants to see kind of everybody back. And I get it. You pay for office space, right? And we built out a beautiful office, and hey, where is everybody, kind of thing. I think we've come to terms with it, and it is working. I think it, kind of went a little too far in one direction, and now we're sort of in a happy place. And even just before this podcast, I talked to one of the designers, and I said, we have a big deadline coming up. I said, how's it going? And she said, it's going really well. I got far. I did work from home yesterday, and I got so much done. And I was like, see, well, there you go. So that's great.
I think about the things that people achieve and the things that people would normally say are think of the chips that we made today. Like people say, you can't make something that smart, that small. We did a test, like I think so many organizations, we did a test on a Tuesday morning to see if our infrastructure would support everybody working at home. The test went well. And then that afternoon we said, okay, everybody worked from home. Mm-hmm. And for 18 months, everybody worked from home. Now, if I did come in and said, you know what, we're going to do a test and now everybody's going to work from home for 18 months, I get the lecture on change management, how this would never work, and blah, blah, blah. But, when people really are committed to make things work. And so I think part of what we need to do is evolve in, yes, there's time that we're in the office, but, how do we look at mentorship differently? How do we look at connection differently? How do we look at charrettes differently? We have to embrace the tools and a new mindset to get to a new day.
Yep, I totally agree. So what's next for you? What are, are you, you want to, grow from, what's your revenue right now? 200?
Yes, so our net is about 125. Nice. Gross is probably about 160, 165. Honestly, I think we have the opportunity to double our size over the next 5 years.
That's great.
And I think the key to that is each one of these practices has its, there's a combined growth strategy, but there's an individual growth strategy for each one of them. And that's what we're focused on.
That's awesome. That's amazing. So as we kind of wrap up here, is there anything that we haven't covered that you would like to?
No, I talked a little bit about myself personally. I have 3 children.
Yes.
So I have a 31-year-old daughter who's a school teacher, a 26-year-old daughter that's in communications, and a 19-year-old son who just started college at my alma mater, actually.
Okay.
I think for all of us to achieve anything that we want to in life, it takes a tremendous amount of understanding and support from our families, and my family has been amazing in that regard.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I say the same thing about my wife and kids. You can't. Thankfully, my wife, is in this business on the furniture side, so she knows a bit about it. And a normal job like this, I'm out every night. And it's work, and she understands that it's work. I always say she jokes she's a single mother during the week, and honestly, at this point, kind of on the weekend too, because I got to catch up. But I totally agree. It is wonderful to have support of the family along it. So none of the kids want to go into the business?
My middle daughter is in our marketing group, and I've told her that it can be a career builder or a career. That's your choice.
That's right.
So we're in early days there, and we'll see. I think, to one of your earlier questions, I did feel a certain amount of pressure to come into the family business, and so I work really hard to let my kids figure out what they want to do in life and see what intersection points there may be there.
Okay, yeah, and listen, I always say in our profession, the marketing role at an architecture firm is the one job I would never want.
Yes.
It's endless. It doesn't stop. There's always more to do. And it's constant pressure.
Yes. Well, a lot of the stuff you see about us on social media is my daughter. So.
Oh, that's great. That's great. So, Ozzie, thank you so much for being my guest here today on the Anti-Architect podcast. You are an amazing leader with an amazing vision. You might actually be the original anti-architect now that I think about it, kind of the way that you talk, which is awesome. And again, thank you. I really appreciate you taking the time.
It has been a great pleasure, and right back at you in terms of everything that you have not only accomplished professionally, but to be able to carve the time to do this, and to have the courage to really take on all facets and take on a thought-provoking name like the Anti-Architect. I think it is really it's something very compelling, and it was one of the reasons that I wanted to be here because I have great respect for you. So thank you.
I really appreciate that. Thank you.